Welcome back to another episode of the Nancy Levin Show. I am so delighted today to bring you my friend and pretend cousin, Dr. Nour. She is a licensed mental health therapist, researcher, professor, and host of the podcast Belonging Reimagined. She founded Nour Counseling, which is a large teaching group practice dedicated to providing inclusive clinical therapy and training. Mona's research on bicultural identity and belonging led her to develop the patent-pending belonging integration model. Her research in belonging teaches folks how to create connection in the world around them and the world within themselves. Just from the bio alone, dear listener, you can tell why I love her so much.
Oh, thank
I'm
you so
so
much.
happy to see you. And I know that when I was on your podcast, you shared the story of how we met. And now I'm going to share it here because it's so fun that we were both told by a mutual friend to sort of be on the lookout for one another. And in the bathroom in Phoenix at Hay Houses I Can Do It, we found each other standing next to one another, looking in the mirror, thinking we could be sisters, we could be cousins. And
Yep.
I do feel like from the moment we laid eyes on one another, we felt an instant connection.
Yeah, it was an instant kinship. And by the way, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Nancy. Pretend cousin Nancy. It just, it's interesting how that happens sometimes with certain people. There's this instant spark, there's this instant mirroring. And so it's interesting that we were standing in the mirror next to one another, because it did feel like, whether I was looking in an actual physical mirror or looking at you, I felt very seen one way or another. And for that, I'm like deeply, genuinely so grateful that we were brought together. And so our mutual friend is a lifer now. Like, if they weren't already, like
for
that
sure.
kind of like sealed the deal. Yeah. Just the deep gratitude. So thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too. And I really am looking forward to unpacking belonging from your perspective.
Belonging was something that I have been curious about from a very, very, very young age. I think since childhood, without having the language to call it that. I think it's a word that we've been using in more recent pop culture, but that's been around in academia for a few decades now, maybe like still not very long, but just for the last few decades. But that feeling of wanting human connection, of needing human connection, inherently having to have it in order to survive, has been there since the beginning of time, I'm sure. And in childhood, my first experience that I recall of feeling like I didn't belong was as early as preschool. And I went to preschool with big curly hair and brown skin and big green eyes. And I lived in the home of the Ku Klux Klan at that time in the mid-70s. And that was a very, very, very scary time for so many Black and brown bodies, particularly Black bodies where I lived. And brown bodies just simply didn't exist in my hometown at that time. So there was a lot of confusion about who I am, what I am, is, how people would ask me, what are you?
What are you?
What are you?
I get that all the time too. I do.
Anyone ethnically ambiguous gets that question. All the time. And we all know it. And so even right now, I feel a sense of mirroring, right? and connection. And so it became a lifelong journey for me to really reclaim this question that felt so othering. What are you? And transform that into who am I? And so this perpetual identity crisis that I was having for decades of my life ended up leading to research. I have a friend who said research is me search, actually another Hay House author,
I
Dr.
love,
Giovanni
yes,
Washington.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, research is me search. And so I think I was kind of obsessed with myself and everyone else. And I always say, hopefully not in a creepy way,
Right.
but really just wanting to understand what this human experience is about. Why are we here? What are we doing here? Why do we need each other? Why does it hurt when we feel rejected by someone? Why does any of that matter? And what are we seeking? And in the research, what I found is that there are actually four primary areas where we seek to experience that spark, that human connection, that experience of really upholding one another and feeling like we belong. And those spaces were and are something that kind of build upon each other. So it's first the self. And then the next thing would be in one-on-one relationships where we hope to experience at least human connection. So our interpersonal relationships. And then building from that would be in community. And so any place where people gather and have shared values in some way. And then from that is in a universal context. And that actually is where we can get really creative. That could be in nature, that could be in the world. Do I feel like I belong in the world? Do I feel like I belong in this state that I live in? Do I feel like I belong in this country that I live in this region of the country that I live in? Do I feel like I belong in this large organization where I work? And so that's really, a place that's bigger than a community. And so that gave more breadth to the idea of belonging, because oftentimes we feel like when we perceive belonging, we think of it as a group of people. And we think of it as, I want to be accepted by a group of people. But really, when we are able to expand where we're able to experience human connection, it gives us so much more agency in where we can experience that and not just rely on this one group of people, like our family or this group of friends that we've kind of fallen into, or our colleagues at work who maybe we have some riff with sometimes, or we don't feel like we quite connect. And it gives us a lot more empowerment in the spaces where we can experience that connection. So that's been part of the journey.
I so appreciate this. And, one of the things that I love about your belonging integration model is that there are sort of these four elements to it. And it has to begin with belonging to ourselves first. Yes?
It can. And so
Okay,
that's
but
what's
it doesn't have
interesting.
to. Okay, so I
It
want to
doesn't
know.
have to.
Okay.
So, in the spiritual world, in kind of more new age-ish spaces, we talk a lot about self-love. But the thing is that we all need each other. And just the way that you and I felt some spark when we saw each other, that belongingness that I felt with you kind of mirrored back and ushered me back to myself in some ways. When I went to your session right after that bathroom break we
Right,
had,
right.
you were teaching a
Yeah.
session at the Hay House event, and it was on shadow work.
Yep.
Of course, it's like, I love your work in it. And there were parts of myself that I had abandoned. Okay, so I did not belong to certain parts of myself, specifically certain shadows parts, right?
Yeah.
That interpersonal relationship with you and connection with you, I would say, and the teachings that you gave, and feeling like I belonged and that I was safe in your presence with you, helped usher me back to those parts of myself so that I could feel like I belong to myself. And I have an extended version of self belonging then. So, yeah, we can use these different spaces to bring us back to ourselves. We see this happen all the time in mental health therapy. I'm a therapist, right? We go to a therapist and we go there, in that interpersonal relationship and their knowledge and their skills and the rapport that you build with them helps usher you back to yourself. We can do that in communities where we go to spaces where people do this all the time when they go to, spiritual spaces or maybe in religious spaces. It could be even in a yoga class, right? Or maybe in a church or a temple or a mosque for some people. circle, or a drum circle, where they go there and they're in that community, and that community helps usher them back to themselves. And so that's one of the ways that we don't have to feel so alone in our self-discovery journey.
Mm. So then that makes me think of these elements of belonging, even that you outlined, from self to sort of one-on-one to community to universal, or
Yeah.
it's not linear.
No.
It is, I don't even, what's the word I want? I want like
They're overlapping.
dovetailing.
Yes, and they're
overlapping,
integrated.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very much so. And they also have different layers to them. So if we think of the different types of belonging, self-belonging, interpersonal belonging, community belonging, universal belonging, the 4 different types of belonging, think of those as spaces in our lives where belonging lives, opportunities to feel connection. But then the question comes in, what is belonging? That's a different question altogether. Like, how are we defining it? And most people kind of reduce the definition of belonging as being accepted. And while that is true, again, it's reductionistic. It's not capturing the whole picture and all the different ways that we can feel that spark, so to speak. So when I looked at my research, which was through some actual studies and interviews that I did with people, also in a large quantitative study that I did, and also in my clinical interviews with my clients, what I found was that there are actually 3 different layers of belonging. So the 4 types are the breadth. So it's broadening where we experience belonging beyond community. And the 3 different, we'll say, elements of belonging are the depth of it. So we have being seen. And that's not necessarily physically, but it's, being seen is when someone, whether it's ourselves or someone else or community, or feeling that in larger systems, means that we feel that someone can identify our likes, our dislikes, our interests, our identities, our lived experiences, our personalities, our quirks, all these things that make us who we are, right? It could be, the different demographics that we have and identity. Like, I'm a Southerner, right? Like, someone really understands what it's like to be Southern, or they really know all the nuances of that. Then, that's something where I feel seen. Like, they know how to make sweet tea and they serve me some sweet tea, right? They really get it, right? So that would be an example of it. Being embraced is another layer of it. That's how most people think of. That's that being accepted is what most people will say. But being embraced means that there's this unconditional positive regard, this intra-psychic connection, this feeling that we have with someone where it feels like we are deeply accepted. Now, what's interesting about being embraced is that you don't have to be seen in order to be embraced. We see this happen a lot of times in friendships or even in families, right? So, I don't always feel really seen by my parents, for example, but I feel embraced. I feel like my parents really, really love me unconditionally. And that regardless of all my quirks that they don't really get, they're kind of like, I don't really get her all the time. I feel like they are going to embrace me and love me and be there as a support system for me regardless. So that's where they're different. So one doesn't lead to the next. And then the third would be celebration. So a celebration of self is when we are able to have someone or some group of people in our lives who are able to acknowledge us, acknowledge our lived experiences in a respectful way that is either public or private, and actually is a behavior. Okay, so being seen is being deeply understood. Being embraced is being unconditionally and lovingly accepted. And being celebrated is an action. It's something that we actually do or someone does for us. And they don't have to come in any particular order. So we see this happen with high achievers all the time, where they will be celebrated and possibly embraced, but maybe not really deeply seen. So people might just be like, wow, that's amazing, and cheering them on and clapping them on, like athletes, like high performing athletes, for example, or, the straight A students, but not really see necessarily the grind of what they're going through and what their experiences are behind the scenes, besides that A plus, or besides that high mark, or besides that gold medal, for example. So there can be a different combination of those things. So the goal is that the more spaces in our lives, self, interpersonal, community, universal, that we can experience belonging, and the more layers within those spaces that we can experience belonging, being seen, embraced, celebrated within those different layers, and in the spaces where they all overlap, then the richer our experiences can be. The richer our experiences can be.
I really love the way that you are sharing about this. What happens for those of us when we are missing elements of belonging? When, like the example you gave, the athlete or the type A, and getting the celebration, or, but not getting the deeply understood. What happens when we're not met in certain arenas?
Yeah. And so when if on the one hand, the more layers that we are experiencing provides more richness, then the flip side of that is the less layers that we're experiencing provides some level of isolation.
Right.
Even if we feel some level of belongingness within a particular area, there will be some level of isolation that we can experience within that space, or disconnect, or lack of fullness, we could say. So I could be like, I really wish that my mom would just get it. I wish that she could just get it. And so there's work to be done in that, and there are choices to be made there. Is the goal always to have all of the things met all of the time by one particular person? Not necessarily. That's putting a lot of pressure on one person, and that's also not always realistic. And so then we can be setting ourselves up for disappointment. So what we want to do is we want to kind of diversify our portfolio, so to speak.
It takes a village.
It takes a village. So we're looking at interpersonal relationships, which is something that a lot of people focus on. If we're looking at interpersonal relationships, it's, do I have people in my life who see me? Do I have one-on-one relationships in my life, people who embrace me? Do I have one-on-one relationships in my life with people who celebrate me? And that would be more of the goal, rather than to hope that this one person can meet the mark on all of those things. And you can have loving relationships with people without having all the things within that one relationship. So being able to say, what I really love about this particular friendship or this one-on-one relationship I have with someone is that when I need for someone to just really understand me and really mirror back to me these values and feel like they really, really get it, that's who I go to. That's the being seen. When I need to just vent and be able to just let it all out, and I don't necessarily need any advice, or I don't need that person to understand, but I just know that I can just yell or scream or cry or just process a little bit, this is the person I can go to. That's the embrace. Maybe they're the same person, maybe they're not. When I really need a cheerleader in my corner, this is the person I can go to. And then it allows us to value people for where they are and for what they are and for how they're showing up.
So a little bit ago, you said that the sort of working definition we have for belonging doesn't quite cut it. What is the definition then that you bring forward?
Yeah, so I define belonging as the experience of being seen, embraced, and celebrated across 4 different areas: self, interpersonal one-on-one relationships, community, and in macro systems. And the key there is that I just said the word and, but it's really and or celebrated. So it's any combination of those spaces. And again, the more we have the more we're feeling seen, embraced, and celebrated in these different areas, then the richer our human experience is in terms of human connection and feeling that spark. And when we feel that spark, that brings so much motivation for us, and it helps tether us to this world. It's really hard to be tethered to this world when we don't have those things. And so for people who are feeling really isolated and really lonely, there tends to be certain areas that are easily accessible, more easily accessible than others. So there have been periods in my life, for example, where I did not feel like I had community who really got me. I had friends, but I didn't really feel that spark. I'll put it that way. I had people around me, but I didn't feel that spark. I had one-on-one relationships. I was part of communities, but I didn't feel that spark. I was in careers that I wasn't happy with. I didn't feel the spark. The way that I took agency over creating my own belonging for me was by starting with the universal belonging. And for me, I found life purpose there. It was like life purpose generally lies in that universal belonging space. It's that thing that's bigger than community, as I said before. And so I decided I'm going to start aligning what I do and how I show up in the world with what I feel like is a life purpose or a life calling for me. And I decided I was just going to choose what that calling was. I wasn't waiting for it to show up either. And like, this is what I'm going to make of my life, is being in this heart space and being in a place of service. Okay, what is that going to look like? So that started ushering me into other spaces, because what happened is then I went on to get a PhD. When I went to get a PhD, I was literally sitting in classrooms with people who have shared values as me. All of a sudden, I started having community belonging. So the universal belonging ushered me into community belonging. From there, I would start asking, I had to have a lot of courage and start asking for study buddies. Hey, do you want to run some things past each other? So I started building one-on-one interpersonal relationships with folks who are still friends with me to this day, who introduced me to other people. And then I introduced them to other people. And then together we created new communities. And that was actually when I developed the counseling practice. I created belonging for myself and for other people. And it just all builds from each other in that way. And then I started meeting people, along the way, not and then, but throughout that process, I met people along the way who really started asking more questions to me about myself. And it started making me think, well, am I this or am I that? Or, or I'd see them doing things, and we're relational beings. And so comparing ourselves to other people is not pathological, by the way. It's when we add judgment to it. So I'd say, oh, you're like this. Well, am I like that? And so I started seeing myself even more. That became richer and richer and richer and richer. So pick one thing. That's what I would say for anybody who's feeling isolated. For me, it was, I think what's most important to me, what I value the most right now, is feeling some sense of purpose, because I felt so directionless. And so that's what was calling to me. So that was kind of the easy thing to touch.
So fascinating. So fascinating. I mean, because of course we are all looking through our own lens first and foremost. So earlier when I said to you, well, it has to begin with belonging to self, right? And you said not necessarily. So yours began with belonging universally.
Yeah.
And then the trajectory you took. Mine took the 180-degree opposite trajectory. Yep. So mine did begin with self, then interpersonal, then community, and then universal.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just fascinating to me, because I think any one of us will be drawn to the point where we can first find our way in, or what draws us in, or what calls us in terms of our sense of feeling or not feeling belonging, and then expand from there. And one of the things I also loved, I loved the language you used earlier about like one-on-one connection, ushering you deeper into yourself.
Yes, yes. And that it wasn't completely linear.
Right,
What I
right,
was just describing
right,
was like one part of it. But in the middle of that, there's like all these other nuanced things that are
right,
happening. Like I'm with a new partner and there's this symbiotic thing that's happening where we're going back and forth, of like, oh, but then I'm learning this about me. And then well, what does that say about you? I don't know. What
right,
does that say about me? And so
right,
there's, during that process, he is providing me more interpersonal belonging and sometimes not. Sometimes we would really butt heads on things, as most of us do. And so we've learned to like press pause and go into an even more nuanced part. This is like more advanced belonging,
yeah,
right?
right,
And that was like, this is like now we're going to belonging like 301,
right,
right? But that was really what I call like, if we go back to science class, symbiosis.
yep,
And there are three different kinds of symbiotic relationships. There is parasitism, where I don't even know if that's the right way to say it, but there's really the parasite, right?
right,
The one where one is benefiting and the other is being harmed, right? There's commensalism, where someone is benefiting and the other person is neither harmed nor is benefiting. And then there is mutualism, where both parties are benefiting. And when we go way back in time, when I was saying that I was feeling really isolated, even though I had a lot of people around me, it was because there were relationships that were parasitic. And so we had to look at like, what kind of symbiosis is happening here?
right.
And it was parasitic. They were benefiting and I was being harmed, which,
Yeah.
by the way, a lot of people who are healers know that feeling.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, very much so. And so at any given moment in my relationships, when things are feeling like a little bit kind of like, let me pause here for a second because things are feeling a little strange and I'm not sure what that is. And I personally am in the business of naming because I like to know things. And if I name things, then I know what I'm working with.
Yeah.
And I'll say, wait, what kind of, is this mutualistic? Is this commensalism? Does this feel parasitic right now? And that helps me make decisions from there on how I want to move forward in those relationships so that I'm not possibly perpetuating that feeling of isolation, which is the opposite of belonging. One of the things, Nancy, that I just want to bring up
Yeah.
that I love so much about the work that you're doing is that shadow work really gives us an opportunity to create more belonging across all of those areas. It really, really does. And that has been one of the kind of, I would say, overlaps in the way that I think belonging work and shadow work can really support one another in many ways. But doing more shadow work more recently with you, and by the way, I've been introducing it more and more to my clients, and I'm seeing the same thing happen with them. It has allowed, kind of going back to the self, right?
Yes.
What you were talking about, really starting that space. So it makes sense to me that that's where you would start, is looking at our own shadows. But going in that space has allowed me to expand my sense of self. So now I'm seeing more of myself just by naming these shadow
Yes.
areas.
Yeah.
And then taking that judgment out, not even taking it out, don't even let it in the door. And that allows me to go deeper into embrace.
Yes.
And then there are ways that I'm able to celebrate it, even just by naming it, by saying, you know what? There's a part of me right now that is saying this and this and that. That's saying, why are you being so lazy? And that is my cue that I'm probably now working too hard and it's time to be lazy and
Right.
relax a little bit. And so it's interesting how that's happened. And then it's improved my relationships interpersonally and even in community, like within our practice, because I'm not projecting those shadows on other people.
Right. I'm so glad that you said this because I have been feeling this too, that there is such an intersection between shadow work and your work around belonging. And
Yeah.
this way in which the more we're willing to dig into our own shadow and see ourselves,
Mhm.
understand ourselves, embrace ourselves, and celebrate ourselves, the more
Yes.
capacity we have to be available to do that for others. And it brings in an enormous element of compassion. If I can have compassion for these elements in me, I can have compassion for these in you, and vice versa. If I have compassion for these qualities in you, I can also have compassion for these qualities in me.
Yes. Yes. And then we can belong back to one another again and back to ourselves.
Yes. I have to bring in another piece here. So I'm really curious about sort of, maybe I would say, the binary of belonging and isolation.
Yeah.
And you did link isolation and loneliness a little bit ago. So, and maybe this even means we have to unpack isolation a little bit.
Yeah.
So, and I'm just, I'm just using myself as an example.
Yeah,
so
let's do it.
I am someone who deeply needs and values my alone time, solitude, being with myself, which could be perceived as isolation. So I'm curious, because it's not how I relate to isolation. And I just told someone the other day that I'm not someone who experiences boredom and loneliness. Like, these are not things that I don't say I've never experienced them, but they're not sort of in my usual, my usual reference place.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I do feel a strong sense of belonging with myself, with others, community, universally, all the things. But I also really cherish my isolation.
Sure. Yeah. So let's unpack it. And I love that you brought this up.
Yeah.
So the way I think of isolation is an exterior construct.
Okay.
That's different.
Yes.
That involves other people, right? That means that you are removed in some way.
Other.
Okay.
Or
there's space.
Okay.
We'll say isolation creates space in some way between you and other people.
Okay.
Does that mean physical space? Maybe. Does that mean emotional space? Maybe. Does it mean energetically feeling isolated or being isolated? Maybe. And feeling and being are different.
Yep.
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
Loneliness is an interior experience. Loneliness is feeling alone within yourself, like you don't even belong to yourself. Right? Possibly. Or that there is this desire to connect with others, and for some reason there's some disconnect, but the desire is there. So that's different.
Yeah.
Now, isolation, when it's by choice, means I'm isolating myself from others.
Okay.
That is an action verb on your part, rather than I'm feeling isolated, where you have lost agency in that. And that's where you're feeling ostracized from other people in some way, or disconnected, not by your own choice.
Right.
Does that help break it down a little bit?
Chosen isolation or separation versus imposed isolation or separation.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Isolating yourself versus being isolated by others.
I love this. I learn so much from you, and I appreciate that.
Back at you.
And I appreciate being able to have this kind of nuanced conversation, because I do feel like it's quite nuanced.
Yeah. Yeah. It really, really is. Yeah. And that's why I wanted to come in and do this work, because I wanted to be able to capture those nuances in the model itself. And we haven't even gotten that much into the overlaps. I think that's like another conversation. But the overlaps are really capture even more of the nuance. And when I say overlaps, it's when you actually look at the belonging integration model physically, or imagine it in your mind, it looks similar to a Venn diagram. And so the self, interpersonal, community, and universal all overlap with one another, because those spaces don't live individually. I am myself, and then I'm in relation with my partner, and then he and I are part of a group practice, right? A mental health group practice. So we're now part of a community. That interpersonal relationship has moved to
Yep.
community, and that community is part of a larger field of mental health universally. And so that would be an example of how there's several overlaps there.
And I have no idea if this was intentional, but the minute I first looked at the graphic of your belonging model integration, it looks like a lotus flower.
I hear that all the
Okay.
time.
And it wasn't intentional.
It was not
I have
intentional.
chills
And it's
actually
funny.
right now. I have chills
Yeah.
because it's even cooler that it wasn't intentional, but it is amazing how much like a lotus flower it looks.
Yeah. And I find that so funny because I'm Egyptian. And so oftentimes lotus flowers are used in Egyptian,
Right.
different kind
Yeah.
of depictions of Egyptian artwork. And it was not intentional. It was really a logistics problem that I was facing, that if I did it in a 4-part where it was, one part
Like
was facing
quadrants
kind
or
of
something.
north.
Right.
One is north, one south, one's east, one west. There was one overlap that wasn't captured. And I couldn't figure out how to capture it. And so I had to maneuver it in all these different ways. And I was like, oh, it captured all of it. And, that was kind of funny watching me, trying to cross-reference all the different variations, combinations, and permutations of the overlaps. And so the lotus flower look is what came of it. And I did not even know that until people started saying that to me. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess it does. And then I heard it over and over and over again. So, yeah, it's kind of cool how it worked out that way.
And the other thing about the graphic to me is also the other thing I thought instantly when I saw it for the first time was how feminine it feels, which to me isn't about feminine or masculine. It just means like there's an invitation. There's a welcoming. There's there's something that feels inviting and enveloping at the same time.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. That is the intention, but I had not thought of that in terms of how the graphic looks. I think because when you start looking at it so much, as you're creating it. Yeah.
But I think it's all the roundness, the curves. Whereas we're used to seeing things like this, even if we see a Venn diagram of like 2 circles with the middle, or we're used to seeing like 4 quadrants, or we're used to seeing something that doesn't feel inviting. And this feels so inviting, which makes perfect sense because obviously belonging, ultimately, I suppose, is an invitation that's open to us that we step in to receive and co-create.
And that's right. Yes. Oh, thank you for saying that. That's beautiful, Nancy. That is beautiful. Thank you so, so much. I really appreciate you.
I appreciate you too. I'm going to bring you back because I want to talk to you more, but we'll talk in other ways too. And I so do appreciate not only the belonging I feel with you, but the belonging I feel at the intersection of the work we are here to do in the world. And so our purpose, our passion, our mission, it's all intertwined. And I really do. I cherish you and I cherish this conversation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I love you and I appreciate you. And I think we have a lot of fun ahead of us. So thank you again. I appreciate you inviting me on the show.
So what is the best way for people to stay connected to you? Where are you on social media the most, or your website? Where would you like to send people?
Yeah. So if people go to my website, Dr. Mona Nour, which is DrMonaNour, drmonanour.com. You'll find all the things. You'll find my newsletter. You'll find links to my social. You'll find all the podcasts. The podcasts on YouTube. You'll find the links there. It's also on all the different audio platforms, Apple, Spotify, all the things. So drmonanour.com.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here again. And
thank you, Nancy.
For everyone listening, I'll be back with you again next week.